Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Discovering the Security Navigator 2025, in which we hope to have a discussion with each other and with you about the contents of this year's Security Navigator report. I'm in a lovely location in the Netherlands today. I know it's Netherlands because just before we started, I saw a woman cycling past and texting with both hands on her bicycle, so I know where I am. Joining me here in Holland today, and you guys can smile and wave, is Simon van der Peer, Tamara, and Anis. And then joining us remotely from Sweden, Diana. Hi, Diana. And Vickers is joining us from South Africa. So our agenda today, very briefly, we want to give you a quick run-through of what is in this year's Security Navigator, why it matters to you, how you can benefit from it. And then I'm going to take the liberty of having a discussion, asking a few questions to some of my friends and colleagues who participated in one way or another in producing the reports. And then we're going to very quickly dive right into taking questions from you. So there is a Q&A panel in the GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar interface. And we really invite you to comment, ask questions there. And we're going to try and accommodate as many of those questions as we possibly can. So full participation from you, please. I was also reminded about 17 times to tell you that there will be a recording of this presentation, which will be sent to you via email, or a link will be sent to you via email within a few days after the end of the session. If the session is scheduled for an hour, if it goes over and there's still people asking questions, what we've done in the past and what we'll do again today is to stay on for a few extra minutes to handle as many questions as we possibly can. So I think let's open the poll up. What we want to do is ask you, as we get started already, which aspects of the report you're the most interested in hearing about. So a poll should appear on your screen, and using that poll, you can give us an indication of kind of where your areas of interest lie, and as much as possible, we'll try and gravitate towards those. While the poll is coming up, I want to take a moment to more thoroughly introduce the panelists. Simon, why don't you find the slide there with everyone's photos on it for me? Thank you. So I've introduced myself already. My name is Charl van der Walt. I'm the head for security research at Orange Cyberdefense. And I kind of lead the team that's primarily responsible for generating the Navigator. But I didn't work on everything directly, so this is a really nice opportunity for me to talk to the people who are really on the cold face. Next to me and to my left here in Amsterdam is Simon van der Peer. Simon, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Yes. As I said, I'm Simon van der Peer. I'm a strategic advisor at Orange Cyberdefense, and I work closely together with your team on all the results you produce in this security research. And I use that information to advise our customers in improving their cybersecurity estate.
And Tamara, thanks for joining us. Not your first rodeo. It was nice to have you. Nice to have you back. Tell us a bit about your work and your interests.
Yeah, thanks. So my name is Tamara Hendriksen. I work for Orange Cyberdefense, the Netherlands. I'm the CISO and the data protection officer. And next to my normal job, I also do research together with a colleague of mine into cyber warfare and the war on privacy. So anything related to issues that we face in the privacy in this modern age, we do research on.
Great, thanks, Tamara, and welcome again.
Thanks.
Let's go across to the first of our remote visitors. Diana, you're joining us from Sweden. I know that you're not feeling very well today, so thanks for making it. But tell us a bit about yourself and your work. You're a big contributor to the Navigator, obviously.
Yeah, thank you. Just checking in, can you hear any background noise, anything bad? Or
no,
can you hear me okay? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, my name is Diana. I work in the Security Research Center team. So I belong to the Global Research Unit. We get the chance to study, do long-term research and study new phenomena or existing ones that somehow have changed. And therefore, we try to understand the threat landscape as deeply as we can. And that we do, for ourselves or for our customers. I personally, I'm quite involved in working with external threat data. So it's either when we see cyber attacks that impact organizations that are then exposed or disclosed on the dark web, or even on the clear web when they use quite accessible communication channels. So it's very interesting to monitor that and to collect data and then analyze them in terms of victimology, but then also what narrative are they presenting to us, and then how can we possibly analyze that with a pinch of salt, really. So it's a really complex cyber threat landscape, and especially because we've seen in recent years things have intensified geopolitically in the physical world, and that then shapes, of course, the cyber threat landscape, and that's where I come in and try to observe and understand what I can.
Thanks, Diana. It's such a pleasure to have you. Diana's always very modest, but she's really, I think, one of the world's foremost researchers into the essence, the nature of cybercrime, and now for the last 2 years, this emerging new issue of hacktivism, which we consider to be really important. So it's great to have you, Diana. Thank you. And joining us from Cape Town in South Africa is Wikus. Who's an expert in so many things I don't even want to start. Wikus, tell us a bit about yourself, what your work is.
Good day, everybody. As Charl said, I'm Wikus Ross. I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, as he alluded to. This year, I had the opportunity to dig into vulnerability management and play around with all the data points, and also with the CyberSOC data and the vulnerability data that we have to get a better understanding of what the lay of the land is and where challenges are for our clients, and where we actually see changes that we need to anticipate and look at. And I also like to do some software development. I was a software developer in my previous life, so I still like to get my hands dirty with that. Back to you, Charl.
Thanks, Wikus, and thanks again for joining us. And finally, I think for the first time with us is Anis. And Anis is one of those very scarce people who actually knows what he's talking about when he's talking about it. And in a world where everyone is suddenly and surprisingly become an expert in AI, Anis is actually an expert in AI and a first-time contributor to the Navigator.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about yourself, Anis, and your work.
Hi, Charl. Hi, everybody. So my name is Anis Trebelsi. I'm a data and AI leader. I'm working on at Orange Cyberdefense France. I'm working on 3 main topics. The first one is AI for security, how using AI for security. The second one is security for AI, how will you use security to secure AI apps of our clients, and the third one is how attackers use Gen AI and to see the evolution during the time, which is very fast.
Well, there is a question that I often get from our customers, and that is related to the threats that the AI pose. So the question that I get often is, how is offensive AI is being used today to target organizations? Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, sure. Basically, it's easier and easier for attackers to use AI and Gen AI, and no need to be an expert to do it. As we can see, as many examples here on this slide, there is more spear phishing, like or smishing, which is specialized text using Gen AI, especially for targeting specified people. And we can see deepfake as well. A lot of deepfake. For instance, there is an extortion of 24 million of an online meeting, where the only real person was the CEO, and all over the meeting were online real deepfake. So it was very interesting to see that. We can see misinformation as well, fake news, misinformation, especially on social media. We can see that as well. And last but not least, the use of Gen AI, especially to find new vulnerabilities, which used by attackers as well.
So I'm just looking at the poll results here that came in as you were talking. Thanks, everyone, for giving us your views. Because you won the bet, the most popular topic is once again vulnerability management, the issue that just won't go away. So we'll definitely come back to you on that. I'm very excited to talk to Vikas about some of his research into that space. Diana, you come in a close second, you and Tamara, hacktivism and cyber warfare. I think, it's one of those things we've been talking about for a long time also, but is really actually an issue today that, we can't ignore. And it doesn't matter if you're not in the government space or not in the intelligence space. It's an issue that's impacting all of us. And then cyber extortion and Gen AI came in like a combined close second, I think we could say. So good distribution of interest. It seems like everything we have to talk about is going to be of value. But I'm going to stick with you then, Anis, if I may, since Gen AI is one of those topics. And I just want to pick up on what you said now about the offensive uses. That is one of the things we describe, that we discuss in the report. But I worked a lot on that chapter on Gen AI and its impacts on the cyber threat. And one of the arguments I made in the report was that many of the things you're describing have sort of accelerated or being done faster or cheaper, but they're not really new from a security defense point of view, except for perhaps the one thing which I didn't discuss in the report, but I've been thinking about more, which is this like deep fakes and attacks on biometrics, right? So like on voice security, on facial security. So what's your view? Is the threat landscape really changing, or?
Like you say, there is no really new tool except for deepfakes and extortion. There is deep voice cases of deep voices we saw before as well. But yes, there is an acceleration of this type of attacks because it's getting easier and easier for attackers to use it. So yeah, we are seeing a rise of this type of attacks and an expansion. So it's easier and easier to use it for attackers, yeah.
Okay, but it hasn't fundamentally changed the landscape yet
from
a defender's point of view. We'll come back to the defensive uses of AI in a moment. But I want to just check in with you on something else. So Anis works actively within Orange and Orange Cyberdefense, developing some of the capabilities that we use. Yes. And of course, one of the things we experience, which I'm sure many people in the audience will have experienced, is this idea of hallucinations, inaccuracy, misunderstandings, etc. And when you start thinking about using these, particularly Gen AIs, in real use cases, then there's an issue of trust. Yeah. Tell us about that. Are we going to reach a point where, like, we trust Gen AI to produce results that we can use?
Yeah, this is a very important point about trustworthy AI. We have a compliance and governance state by state, country by country about it, and it's very important to have it. And then we need to embrace it and to develop it for our client organization, of course, customer organization. And the thing is, we have other thing about confidentiality of data, which is very important to provide a secure use of Gen AI tools. So it's very important to have it. And AI developers, data scientists, etc., need to be trained about how to develop algorithm with ethics and responsibility, which is another important point as well. And the transformation of the work as well, because there are new tools, and people using these new tools need to be trained as well to forbid the shadow AI, for instance, and to stay competitive for the business. definitely.
Do you use Gen AIs yourself?
Yeah.
And you use the public ones like ChatGPT?
No, I use the GNU2 one, which is the orange one, because of course I'm using the orange one because I'm working for Orange, so of course I'm using the orange one. But by myself, I try a lot of different open source models as well to check how it's possible to do it and for specific tasks.
Okay, thank you. So I want to keep talking to you about AI, but I'm going to make two diversions. The first is just to remind you in the audience, thank you for the questions that have already been submitted. But please feel free, if you have questions on anything that's being said or anything that you've come across in the Navigator, pop them into the Q&A channel and we'll start processing them for you. That's the first digression. And then the second one is, before I come back and talk about the use of AI in defense, you wrote a very interesting chapter for us in the Navigator about using machine learning models to detect weak signals in security telemetry. But I want to talk a little bit about those weak signals and what we say about them. And Vikas, you authored a chapter in the Navigator in which we examine the findings over the year of our multiple cyber SOCs across the world, where we do threat detection. And you have the privilege of having the most beautiful graphic. Oopsie, someone, why don't you find that chart for us? The most beautiful graphic in the report. Tell us a little bit in brief what the report says about what we're detecting with our threat detection capabilities on our customer estates.
Yeah, thank you, Charl. I think you're referring to that Sankey chart, that ribbon chart, which we highlight the actors, action, and assets, various categories. And this year we saw that actually that external and internal actors were quite closely aligned. If you look at it as a percentage, and if you follow that onto the actions side, you see those ribbons as they flow. Hacking and misuse also seemed quite very much the same share of all the incidents that we've seen for true positives, right? Confirmed incidents. Moving to the right-hand side, the assets being impacted through these actions, end user device, 39% there at the top and server. Now, if you compare that to the previous years, actors, we saw external more or less the same at 44% and internal at 37%. So internal definitely grew. Similarly, misuse actually grew quite a lot compared to the previous year. In the previous Security Navigator, misuse was actually previously 16% and now it's sitting at 29%. But end user assets still remains the most impacted asset class in all these incidents that we've analyzed and classified. But it grew actually quite more from, what was it, was about 30% last year. End user was 28% and now it's sitting at almost 39%. So it's grown quite dramatically. But if you go on to the next part of it and we drill into that misuse category, that misuse action, we actually see that in this year, this is across all threat actions for this year's report, the misuse, and specifically in the case of unapproved hardware, software, script workaround, that stands up. It jumped, it's like rocketed to the top, going from about 13-14% previously to almost 25% of all the threat actions that we've seen. Now, if you also just glance down those labels on the left-hand side, you can see that misuse and error stands out. Now, what that means for me is that there's some sort of problem here with regard to policy adherence, or people just making mistakes for some reason, or just general negligence as well. But it also speaks to the type of detections that is in place to actually not just look for external actors doing bad things, but internal actors as well. And this also mentioned shadow IT, and I think shadow IT can definitely play a role here in these types of transgressions. If we go into looking at not just if you look at the ratio, and you mentioned that whole signal to noise ratio, in the next slide, you'll see that actually that there's a trend towards the whole detection ratio, like your true positives versus your false positives, or your confirmed and your other. And this year we see that there was quite a lot more on the false positive side of things, right? That big blue bar on the right. Whereas the the detections for the true positives has actually shrunk relatively to the previous years. It stayed the same, but on the overall, the false positive detection actually grew quite a lot. Now, if you drill into the false positives, if you look at the next part of this slide deck, you'll actually see that the biggest percentage of that false positive is actually legitimate activity, and that's the 77%, right? And this is where actually that whole signal to noise type of thing comes in. And this is also with the aid of our clients actually giving us the feedback and confirmation of this. And that's what makes things so much more difficult to actually detect what is legitimate and what's not legitimate, and finding that balance in that signal to noise ratio. And that's more or less, I think, what you were alluding to when you were asking at least that question. Back to you.
Vickers, thanks. So I think one of the most interesting things that we do and that I'm proud of in the report is that we don't just show what we detect and report to the clients, but we also give this insight into how much work, I guess, it takes to filter out this noise. And those ratios between true positives and false positives are quite extraordinary. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we're down to like 14%, 15% of the alerts that our analysts respond to end up being confirmed true positives. Is that right?
Yes, you're right, Dave.
So I think that comes full circle back to you, Anis, then, because one of the things that you've been working on with our CyberSOCs is how we can use machine learning to preemptively or more effectively identify the real issues amongst all of those weak signals. So tell us a little bit about that work and what we say in the Navigator about that.
Basically, we have been using machine learning since several years as far as Orange Cyberdefense through machine learning directly inside the editor solutions, or developing our own solution of machine learning. Like this, it's like weak signals. It's possible to detect more complex patterns, and especially for specific use cases which are not possible to be built by with a rule, classical rule. So it will complete the actual detection. And for rules which will need a lot of tuning, due to the learning of the infrastructure with machine learning, we will learn the infrastructure on a specific parameter. We will have less false positive. So this is a very nice point as well. Less false positive, less tuning. So it's better for our analysts as well.
Anis, one of the questions that we got in the chat, which I thought was quite interesting, and I've been hearing people talk about it, is the impact of regulation on AI innovation.
Yes.
And the question specifically says over-regulation. Do you have a sense that regulation, particularly in the EU, is impeding innovation in AI?
Yeah, it could be. It could be. That's the difference between, for instance, the US, which are very proactive, and the Europe. But it's very important to have this type of laws to be sure to protect our data, protect our customer data, our privacy. So it's very important to have this law. Just maybe we need a little bit more balanced, but we need this type of law, definitely. We need it to develop tools we can control it, because the end is not to let the AI do the stuff, it's to control how AI is built in and how we can use it, especially for explainability of AI, which is a very good point.
And that all goes full circle to what you were saying earlier about, what did you call it, trusted AI? Or
trustworthy AI, exactly.
Because without those regulations and guardrails, then you have a different problem, right?
Exactly. So we need it, definitely we need it to be safe, basically to be safe and to be sure, but just the balance between the innovation and the regulation to find it properly.
Vickers, I'm going to surprise attack you with a question here. I can see he was responding in the chat. But because a question came in while you were talking about the findings of the threat detection teams about the value of XDR. And I think basically the question is XDR going to make all of these signal to noise ratio problems go away? Do you have an opinion? I know it's not a field that you particularly study.
Just a general opinion. The problem what you're normally always going to have is that if XDR is going to be the magic bullet, then everything else goes away. So I don't think necessarily XDR is the magic bullet. It's once again one of those tools that you have to set up correctly. You have to tune it. You have to actually understand what its capabilities and extent is. And XDR requires quite a lot of access to your sensors. You're from perimeter all the way through before you to correlate things correctly. And yes, it's probably going to be able to do things very well, but I definitely think there's still going to be some blind spots, some things that you have to still go and rely on manually to actually go double check, or actually completely use a different tool to complement it. But the challenge is, I think you have to first understand the limitations of your tools and actually then work through that to actually know where your blind spots are. But XDR is not necessarily a magic bullet in its own.
Sim and Tamara, you're both at the cold face of security. Have we ever seen a security technology that's turned out to be a silver bullet that's like fundamentally changed the security game for us?
Well, there have not been a silver bullet security solution that I have seen in my career. No. But I'm sure that today we see technologies evolve and there are new capabilities coming up that can really help in dealing with the challenges that come with the cyber threats. So we can work faster, we can have more visibility on things and improve actually the work of people within the security realm.
Tamara, impactful security tool that's changed your
I guess
job?
I'm putting on my CISO hat now and step away from cyber warfare. But no, as Wikke said, magic bullet, no, I haven't found it yet. I haven't found a tool that does everything for me and gives whole visibility of everything that's going on within my company and with my employees. There's always a downside to a tooling, and there's always something that I don't see. So I guess no magic bullet, but every tool that gives me more insight and gives me more security for my company and that I can safely present to the board that we're doing a good job and that we're safe, it always helps. But magic bullet, no, I haven't found it.
And quick poll, all of the panelists, quick poll, to what extent is AI and Gen AI going to change our jobs? Like 100%, 50%, 10%? Let's start with you, Simon.
Well, I'm sure that AI is going to make me more efficient and more precise in the things I do.
Percentage?
50%.
Tamara?
I'm going to say 50.
50.
Yeah.
Diana? And Diana loves Gen AI. It's a new best friend.
I go with 50 as well.
50. Wikke? He's a skeptic.
49.
49. Okay, Anis.
Okay, I'll say a little bit more. Yeah, definitely. The efficiently we have with Gen AI is incredible. For everything, developing, making some sum up of documents, a lot of job will be impacted, but it's just a tool. We just have to keep that in mind. It's just a new tool. We will use it, and it's not going to replace us. Definitely not. It's just a new tool. We will be more efficient, like you said, Simon, and definitely better for work.
And if I may, I have had a few discussions last month when we were talking about the results of the Security Navigator. And of course, Gen AI and AI will help us to be more efficient, but still at the same time, there remains a huge challenge. And I think if we see the poll, the high number of vulnerabilities that are still out there are quite challenging for many operations, for many organizations actually. So Wikus, is there anything we can do today, or do you have interesting insights in dealing with vulnerabilities from your side?
Well, I mean, if you think about the vulnerabilities in general, then vulnerabilities is something that we don't really have control over. And vulnerabilities is something that's present in software or hardware, whatever systems we have chosen to use. So it's something that's inherent to our own architecture, own designs that we've somehow over years put together. And unfortunately, these things get discovered and gets exploited. So the problem with the vulnerability that you don't know of is it's latent, right? It's there and someone is going to exploit at some point. The thing is though, you have to be reactive to when it gets discovered. Vulnerabilities in general is something that we are aware of. We know that's something we have to deal with. So we have to also work through this list of vulnerabilities that we are discovered. But overall, I think strategies with regards to vulnerability management is diverse, and it depends also on the business itself. If the business can have resources to actually deal with the load of the vulnerability, small businesses probably have less resources than larger businesses, and larger businesses tend to be more regulated and tend to have very well-defined processes. Yet they also struggle to actually get ahead of the curve. I think in general, when we look at vulnerability management processes, I think we've got a slide for that. But the whole thing is like you have to cut it through the middle almost, if you will. You have to be like risk. You have to look at it from a risk point of view. So in other words, the whole risk reduction aspect, and also from a threat mitigation point of view. So in other words, you have to be proactive and you have to be reactive. Unfortunately, but proactive is where you define your own terms. So in other words, the risk reduction is where you actually reduce your overhead, you reduce whatever exposure you have. With threat mitigation is you anticipate what is coming and what actually is going to be coming at you, and you have to be able to deal with that. So I think the strategies would definitely depend on your, starting at your first principles. Where are you coming from, and what is it that you have to deal with?
Vikas, I want to come back to you on this topic. I think since we've sort of gravitated there, but just to Timothy, there's a attendee called Timothy who asked to see the Sankey chart again with the threat detection data. Timothy, we're going to come back to that if I can find a spot for it, but otherwise we will make the report itself available to you in the slides, and you can have a look at it there. And Anis, we will come back to the weak signals again. Maybe we can bring that all together at some point. But Vikas, sticking with this chart, this diagram we actually published in the previous Navigator also, and now we've published it again. And I think it's a very powerful idea that speaks to the notion that in vulnerability management, we're really dealing with two very different things, right? We're dealing with risk reduction on the one side and threat mitigation on the other side. And I think you and me have even argued that maybe the term vulnerability management is not useful anymore because it's sort of too broad given how distinct these two disciplines are. And threat mitigation, I think, is the more obvious one, right? That's where we get intelligence of some form that a vulnerability is being exploited in the wild. We have to correlate that intelligence with some understanding of the assets that we have that are exposed onto the internet, and then we either need to block or patch or turn off or something. That's quite intuitive. But the risk reduction problem is a harder one because it has to happen at scale, right? With these thousands of devices, tens of thousands of applications, et cetera, et cetera. And in the report, you do this piece about probability of exploitation and probability of compromise, right? Where you illustrate how quickly the attacker's odds of successfully compromising a workstation or a system escalate as the size of the estate grows. Won't you talk us through that? Because I think that has very significant implications for vulnerability management. And I think your findings are actually quite disruptive as far as our thinking about that problem is concerned.
Certainly. So when we looked at this problem, we went back to a couple of years, so 10 years ago, giving our age away here. But then in 2015, John Lambert, a Microsoft security engineer, published a blog post where it basically described this idea of, attackers thinks in graphs, defenders thinks in lists, and as long as this is true, attackers will win. But Lambert also went on to say that, defenders also have access to this list or this graph, right? So they actually have the best position to understand how the infrastructure looks and how it's connected. So that when we looked at this this problem, we actually realized, all that most attackers do, especially the opportunistic ones, so ransomwares and these guys, they just try to land somewhere on their graph, right? They will go after something they can see, and if it fits within their profile and they have the ability to go at it, they will see if they can be successful, right? So, and this is where we put this attacker success chart up here, where we are basically saying if an attack has a 5% chance through all the way to, let's say, 40% chance, and we increment that, we can actually plot this like potential mathematical or statistical chance of them being successful at compromising something. So with the idea that this attacker just wants to land somewhere in this graph that you have, and then they will, once they're in their graph, they will then repeat this process again, figure out where they are, recon a bit, see what they've got access to, and then rinse, repeat, go at the next vulnerability in your environment. Also, caveat, they don't necessarily just have to use vulnerabilities. They can abuse features in the system, as we saw many times. But in this case, what we have here, let's say you have an attacker that's got a 5% chance. That's that bottom curve there. Basically, after about 100 attempts at a vulnerability or a set of vulnerability in an environment, they should mathematically or statistically, if you will, have a chance of actually being successful at least once, right? And if you increase the skills, let's call it the so-called skill of this attacker, then you would eventually get to the point, let's say if your attacker is 40% successful most of the time, then all of a sudden their chances go to like 10, within 10 attempts, 13 attempts, they would have a successful exploit. So given the fact that if you have got an environment with thousands of vulnerabilities available, exposed to this attacker or accessible by this attacker, and they go at it enough, and you don't do anything to stop that, then they will be successful. So given enough time, given enough attempts, theoretically this attacker will actually get into your environment by some form or means, right? So that's the whole idea behind this prospect of the fact that that some attackers are just not persistent enough. But if attackers persistent enough and they actually get lucky enough, if you're statistically lucky enough, they will get in.
But the flip side of what you're saying, which I thought is the real takeaway from that part of the report, is that you can reduce the attacker probability in two ways, right? If the attacker's less skilled, they've got less probability of succeeding. That's reflected by the different colors in that chart. If you patch particular vulnerabilities or remove hosts or remove vulnerable software, that is going to reduce the probability of success on any given computer. But if you have enough computers in an ecosystem, then eventually, before too long, the attacker reaches the point where they must be successful somewhere, right? Statistically speaking.
Right.
And I think that's what makes that split view of the vulnerability management process so interesting, is that when you have a small population of systems like that are exposed to the internet, then you can significantly reduce the probabilities by patching a system out or removing it or changing a firewall rule. But if you have 10,000 systems in an environment, then actually removing one vulnerability or one system doesn't significantly change this curve. And so it then begs the question, which I think is the point in that report, it begs the question, is it even worth doing that then? And shouldn't we be thinking fundamentally differently about how we address risk reduction in those big environments? And maybe, and I know this is like sacrilege in contemporary cybersecurity, but maybe a threat-informed or a risk-informed approach in bigger environments doesn't make any sense at all. Maybe the trick is rather to focus on the efficiency of your patching processes and just do whatever's the cheapest and the easiest to lower the water so all the boats not sink but drop.
Yes, I was going to use that analogy as well, but you just used the reverse version of that. But I agree with you. So it's all about getting ahead of the curve. It's not necessarily about patching all the stuff. So if you look at an EPSS type of approach, which we have on screen here, we plotted some vulnerabilities that we found in an environment and trying to find the correct strategy, you can see that if the EPSS score is on the bottom there, and the coverage or the percentage of the CVEs that will be patched is on your y-axis, then depending on where you select your, let's say in this case, EPSS, because EPSS is about likelihood of exploitation of a vulnerability, you start to see that at some point in time, that orange curve, which is the one going from the bottom left and then suddenly rises on the bottom right, your efficiency goes up, right? But that means that if at the same time your coverage goes down and your effort also surprisingly goes down, which means you have less vulnerabilities to patch. But that comes in at the point where you have to make a decision, at what cost do I want to do this? Do I sacrifice coverage? But at the same time, you say, at least I get something patched. And that's where the strategy comes in. Do we go for like point A, where we say, efficiency meets coverage, when we're happy with that? Or do we go at point B, where we see where effort and efficiency is almost equal, but at the same time, we probably going to have to patch a little bit more on the coverage side, so we win on that side. So you have to make these trade-offs, saying, well, if I'm going to go full-on efficiency at the right-hand side of things, you're probably going to not have good coverage, but at least you get something done. And that's, I think, this argument that we have is like, depending on how overwhelmed you are and how strategic you are, you could also make the choices. Well, I need to get something done. Let me choose the let's say the efficient route over the 100% coverage route.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in contemporary cybersecurity, we're focused on coverage, right? So finding and patching those exploitable vulnerabilities. But if reducing those doesn't meaningfully reduce the probability that an attacker will succeed, then maybe it makes more sense rather to focus on efficiency and simply do the least amount of work. And Vickers, I could debate this with you all day, but I think we need to move on to some other topics. There's a series of questions, Vickers, around your comments, and I wonder if I could ask you to try and respond to those in chat, because I want to turn to you, Diana, and I know you're expecting me to ask you about cyber extortion, but I'm not going to ask you about cyber extortion. I want to ask you about hacktivism, or not hacktivism, whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. So you and our colleague Ben wrote, I think, a very impactful and meaningful study on the emergence of what you call the establishment era of hacktivism. And it's been picked up, and we're getting a lot of traction with that work. So give us a rundown of what you and Ben were saying there and what it means.
Yes, exactly. We co-authored a research piece for Ben Gibney, my colleague in Utrecht, where we started out with the question whether or not what we're observing as hacktivism is actually hacktivism, because it's been intensifying due to geopolitical conflicts. So I think we would say, our case study that we did would focus on post-2022 era. But before ending in what we see today and what it actually means, we did dive into historical context, So let's start with a term that's given to us, that's used by us as, defenders and individuals, but also the media, and that is hacktivism. And what does that actually mean, And hacktivism comes from cyber activism, and we acknowledged, or how do you say, created 3 different eras that we found have developed until today what we see. And it's very different from where cyber activism actually comes from, really, like traditionally, where we see, the first groups kind of practicing civil disobedience, the first signs of digital protest, really, for, free access to information, for privacy, for accountability, and so on. And that was like, mid-80s, 90s already. And then we're moving a little bit into into activities, cyber activities that go into anti-establishment. So where we see activities and protests, digital protests that are anti-government, anti-war, anti-nuclear, which I think rings a bell when you hear the term of hacktivism. But we have moved towards establishment, where we actually see pro-establishment or in support of an establishment, and that can be, for example, a government. So the recent activities that we're observing are often in line with specific nation states. And to analyze it a bit more closely, we looked at one of the most active pro-Russian hacktivist group that we've been monitoring and observing since 2022, because that group, like many others these days, was a direct result out of a conflict, a war, the Ukraine war. And we've seen similar groups acting similar in favor of governments that are directly connected to conflicts such as in the Middle East as well. So what you see now on the screen is it's a bit of everything. So it's based on the case study that we did. So on the right bottom is the data that we collected. So we actually looked from August 2022 to August 2024, so that we had a 2 years span. And in that 2 years, we collected over 3,200 messages that we then declustered, so to say, to look at how many targets were impacted, and that was over 6,000. So we could then actually analyze who is impacted by that specific group the most, and we found, for example, that 96% of that organizations from private and public sector alike were based in Europe. And then we did a country breakdown as well, and there are a few countries that make sense to us in a way that last year, in the previous year's Navigator, we did an analysis where we looked at similar activity, and then why do we see specific countries more impacted than others, and we could find a connection when countries were either geographic proximity, so they were close to conflict, close to war, and therefore in a geographical area of tension, but then also governments or countries who have promised support to countries would also show up. And we see also NATO as an institution being impacted by that group, but also countries that had joined NATO recently, in that case Finland and Sweden, or leaders within that organization that were then impacted. So that is one, but beyond the incidentology, so to say, so who's been impacted the most in actual, quantitative data and statistics, we wanted to look a bit closer to see if we can, find something else and understand their patterns. And I know the question often comes about sectors and industries, for example, and again, we see private and public, impacted alike. But what we also found is that it didn't actually matter too much to the threat actors from which sector the victims were from, but what kind of representation they give for a country. So you would see in the narrative and the messaging of threat actors how they address countries, and they would say, today we attack a specific country. So that makes it very difficult to really give advice whether or not or give advice specifically which sector is impacted, because it can actually impact many that might symbolize something and help to spread a broader message, a geopolitical message. And what we then identified was in the messaging, we find reasoning of the threat actors, right? So we kind of did a keyword analysis where we said, okay, we are actually recognizing specific events, geopolitical events that seem to be attracting those threat actors. And you see right now a map on the screen. And if you look at the legend, those were the keywords that we decided to zoom in. So we found that a lot of messages would address local protests and strikes where threat actors would sympathize and align with local concerns, which is a strategic communicative strategy from them. We've seen a lot of elections being impacted, and it was very relevant last year, of course, and it will be in the future, where they try to undermine public trust in election systems. And last year, was a year of elections, and we've seen quite a lot there. And then we've seen summits and conferences, especially like peace conferences, for example, or anniversaries of some of the countries. They would address those. And the map that you see right now, you cannot imagine how difficult it was actually to create this, because there's a lot to read in this map. It shows within 2024 only. So even if we had that data of 2022, it became too complex. So we had to decrease the time span that we wanted to analyze to prove our point that we see timed campaigns of the threat actors. And here you see the circles, the color of the circles represent, the topic, like what did they wanted to disrupt in their communication and their claims. You see the amount of circles and the amount of attacks, and then you see the size. You see the amount of targets. I hope that makes sense. We explain that in detail, of course, in the report. And it was really interesting to see that Belgium and Austria, by the end of last year, September, October, I think it was, they both had elections in different levels, municipality and national, and just before and during elections, they would target specific organizations and institutions just to become aware to the public, right? And the media, unfortunately, then plays a role to amplify this, which unfortunately helps with the fear and uncertainty and doubt, and helps to set that seed of doubt into the public.
Which is one of the reasons why we don't want to name these actors in our reporting, right? As we don't want to feel that fire.
Yeah, exactly. And also it's a proxy of others, right? I mean, we did a case study of one of the most active one, but they are very similar groups with very similar motives and modus operandis, and it's become really a network. And we actually not going to show this today because it's extending too much. But we actually showed also what are the alliances of these groups, because they do repost their content and they do help each other. They do join operations when they do op France or op Denmark or something like that, or a specific geopolitical event.
Yeah. So Diana, Belgium is quite largely seen here in this image. So a question that we get is how does this infect our clients, and what can they do about this?
Yeah, that's a good one, and I think it's a tricky one to give concrete advice, really. So again, I think a big aha moment for me doing that research was that, unfortunately, it doesn't matter who you are as an organization. If you will bring them attention in one way or the other, if you are public transportation, a financial institution, if you're very well known for that country. And I think also Belgium, the role it plays for the EU as an institution, unfortunately, also brings that intention to them, then most likely you will help aim them to spread this incivility that they want us to perceive, right? They want us to lose trust in our governments and public safety and how our elections work and so on. But of course, there are technical measurements that one can take. So depending on on what business you are and what resilience to have to unavailability, there is of course DDoS protection that you can do, vulnerability mitigation, attack service management, all of that. And I think the most important actually is awareness and education of your users, but also as individuals and as a society, to be aware that that is happening, that they're trying to shape this distrust, and then communication. So as an organization, then try to have communication strategies in place that kind of counter their narrative, and regain the trust of your stakeholders, really. Yeah, I think that would be high level from my side.
Thanks, Diana. We received a question via the chat also about the overlap between groups like this. And as you mentioned, these numbers specifically speak to one very prolific pro-Russian group, but that doesn't mean that necessarily they're state-sponsored or state-backed. But of course, in the context of the war on Ukraine, we've seen both, right? We've seen this very new, novel emergence of state-aligned groups, but potentially independent, but also actions by Russian state actors themselves, and of course on the other side by pro-Ukrainian activists and the Ukrainian state. And tomorrow's cyber warfare is obviously an area of interest to you. And we're approaching now 3 years, I think, since the beginning of that war, which is hard to believe.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit like what we've seen in the context of that war from a cyber point of view.
Yeah, so I mean, we're coming up to the 3-year anniversary, basically, of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And what we see there is, it was interesting because we saw a spike of cyber attacks basically happening right before the invasion. So a lot of Ukrainian targets were hit, which kind of resulted in feeling that something was going to happen, which in the end did happen. So a lot of Ukrainian targets were hit, especially on the communication front, but also on the energy and power grid, which were hit before from 2014 already. And what we saw there is next to the targets based on energy and power grids and stuff like that, we saw an attack on the communication satellite network, the KESAT, which basically made sure that Ukrainian troops and the military couldn't communicate fully and properly in the beginning. So you saw a cyber attack influencing the way that the battle was fought on the ground. So boots on the ground was influenced by cyber attacks. And there you see this hybrid warfare coming up, which we see is cyber warfare. It's not just cyber attacks and not just the boots on the ground and not just the tanks rolling through the city, but it is cyber attacks influencing the way that the war is fought. A lot of DDoS attacks were seen. There was a spike in DDoS attacks, especially on financial institutions, making sure that there was no money between banks and people couldn't get their money. You saw a lot of attacks on news networks, media outlets, so people couldn't access news outlets to see what was actually going on. You saw a lot of social media influence, spreading of mis and disinformation online, sometimes with the use of AI, as you mentioned before, which makes sure that propaganda was a big part, or is a big part still, of the Russia-Ukrainian war. And that was something new, that the whole influence of people, the whole propaganda part of the war, really was online and on social media, which had a big influence and a big part on influencing people's minds and how they feel about what was going on in Ukraine.
Anis, Tamara's comment that with the use of AI, one of the panelists also asked, things like Worm GPT, are they?
Yeah.
Is that something that's real, or is it something that everyone is just saying? That this is enabled by AI, it's supported by AI?
No, it's definitely real.
It's for sure happening.
Yeah, it's happening. So we can see attacker use Gen AI, especially as you said on social media for like fake news or deepfake videos, and we can see more propaganda based on deepfake videos, and it's very challenging today to know if a video is a trusted one or not. So there is a research field in this way as well to say, okay, we are sure this video is a good one, it's not a deepfake. So there is still progress to do in that field as well. So yeah, it is definitely it's happening. Yeah, definitely.
So folks, we've reached the end of the hour. But there are still several of you with us on the channel, and we still have several questions. I certainly have some more questions. So we're going to extend, I think, for another 10 or 15 minutes. So please stay with us if you have the extra time. Please keep hitting us with your questions. And my panelists have kindly agreed to stick with us way into their coffee break. They take lunch and coffee very seriously here in Europe. So it's a big sacrifice. Please recognize that by sticking with us and let us have your questions. So Tamara, sticking with you, we've seen these various forms of hybrid warfare, as you say, where cyber sort of complements or augments what's happening kinetically on the ground in Ukraine. Then we've seen what Diana is describing, which is like an even further hybridization in which non-state actors are getting involved, both directly and indirectly. I think in the case that Diana studied, it's more indirectly. They're not engaging so much in the operations, but more in the perception that that people have of the conflict. But of course, while that's happening in Ukraine, we also have another very serious conflict playing out in the Middle East. Does that look the same? Is it very different? Are we seeing the same sorts of patterns emerging?
Basically, if you look at it, if you lie them next to each other and you look at cyber attacks and what is happening, basically the same, yes. But when the Ukrainian war started, we saw what I said, a spike in cyber attacks. There was something coming. We knew that Russia was really gearing up to disrupt and disadvantage the Ukrainian country and citizens. But what we also know is that in the Middle Eastern conflict, it was basically a surprise attack. So there wasn't really any cyber activity that really told us that something was happening. You know, the attack on that happened on the 7th of October is basically a surprise attack, and that's how we see it, which is then part of a bigger operation, and then initially after that attack, the cyber activities really started to happen. We saw a lot of DDoS attacks again, same as in Russia, Ukraine. And specifically in this one, we saw a lot of malware. We also saw a lot of malicious apps being introduced and making sure that people were downloading that and to spread malware. And these apps looked really professional. They were specifically looking at where missiles were going to strike, that you had actual information on, that you knew you were safe in that area. So a lot of people downloaded those apps, but actually introduced malware into their networks. That was specifically for the Middle Eastern conflicts, which we saw. And then also the use of social media. We saw that a lot of digital activism was taking place, something that we've not really seen before, but really shaped the way that people feel about the conflict as well. And that was something that we really saw in this Middle Eastern conflict. So a lot of similarities, but also a little bit of nuance in the differences between how cyber activities were used. Also thinking about that Israel is a big cyber capability nation. A lot of technology is coming from Israel, specifically on intelligence, cyber defense. So we know that it was taking place, and we knew cyber activities were supposed to be part of this.
So staying with that conflict, but Diana, turning back to you, the other thing, of course, that we saw more in the conflict in the Middle East than we saw in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is this escalation by hacktivist groups to kind of cyberkinetic impacts, right? So predatory sparrow and cyber avengers targeting OT platforms and seeking to have or to demonstrate some sort of kinetic impact. And my question to you is kind of around the issue of terminology and whether whether we're talking about a distinction without a difference. So as far as our clients are concerned, as far as sort of regular people, does it matter whether an actor is a hacktivist or an establishment era or an anti-establishment era, or whether they're state-backed? Like, what difference does it actually make? Where does the interest in those distinctions come from?
Yeah. Super good question. I was just typing while you called me out on LinkedIn, answering a very similar question, whether or not we should call this maybe terrorism was one example now. I think it's really important that we use the right terminology, and maybe there's a need for either something new here, a new terminology or not, but it will help us in terms of accountability. And I've had different exchanges also on LinkedIn with people before, where we say, okay, so if those aren't activists, what are they? And then especially the activity that we see around conflicts. And I think there are definitely lines that were crossed into other spaces, and I think the very least might be cybercrime. So then if we can't call this hacktivism any longer, then let's consider this a crime, because then further steps could be taken there. Or cyber militia is a good term to look at, or start to look at, when we see nation states supporting or even encouraging non-civilian hackers to engage in hostilities.
So those distinctions, I think, are significant, particularly from like a policy and a regulatory point of view, and in order for us to surface a real, understanding of what's happening in the threat landscape. But another interesting point, I think, that's raised in the Navigator is the similarities between some of the techniques, technical and coercive techniques that hacktivists use, and some of the techniques that we see cyber extortionists using. And we haven't spoken about cyber extortion today yet. But one of the things you point out in the report is just how much more extortative it's becoming, right? Like how much more, if there's innovation in that space, it's not so much in the malware or the initial access vectors. It's more in the development of coercion, right? And what we call cognitive attacks. Can you talk us through some of those similarities, like between what we see hacktivists doing in principle and what we see cyber extortionists doing in principle?
I mean, we definitely see, and I think we spoke slightly about that last year already, that we see, as you say, similarities where they change modus operandi basically and switch between financially motivated form of crimes to politically motivated attacks and vice versa. So we've seen a few groups actually doing exactly that. We would see a typical hacktivist tool such as a DDoS attack, but then asking for a ransom to stop their attack, for example, which then actually crosses the line of being politically motivated and as entering the financially motivated crime, for example. And we've seen politically motivated groups that are joining ransomware as a service operations, or creating new ransomware as a service operations, and then earning a little bit of money and returning back to their politically motivated roots, for example. So it's been quite a messy space.
Yeah, and what I find quite interesting is that hacktivism is very much about coercion, right? It's about bullying someone or changing their mind about something. And of course, state-backed activities are also very much about changing the mind of an activity, right? I mean, it's effectively war is projection of power, and a DDoS, it's seen through one perspective, is a projection of power. But there are also financially motivated attacks, of which one big category is extortion, also as a form of projection of power. But then the others are, carding or BEC or whatever. So I've got a question actually shifting to you two guys with your CISO hats on. It comes from Sebastian, and he asks about the complexity, the difference in complexity between hacktivist-based attacks and crime-related cyber attacks, I guess, like cyber extortion. Or do you guys have a view, like in terms of how our clients and you tomorrow personally defend against those different threat actors? Is your mindset very different? Do you prepare differently for them? Do you prepare with those different threat actors in mind?
To be honest, not really. When I look at the discussion also between the different terminology of an hacktivist or a state-sponsored activist or anything related to that, as the one who's defending, it doesn't really matter who's attacking. As a CISO, it doesn't really matter who's attacking me, as long as I can protect ourselves in the end. So from my research hat, yeah, I do agree that it's interesting to look at the terminology, but from a defense hat, not so much. So I don't prepare differently. The only thing that I'm really, not scared of, but look at in a different way is possible nation states. Because they have a different operation of trying to get into your system. I mean, with my cyber warfare research, we see nation states can be in your network for already 10 years or something, just gathering information. That happens. It's not something that's really far away. It happens. I mean, we have people in Orange Cyberdefense that help customers who are affected by nation states. I mean, it's not something that we should think about lightly. But it's not that we prepare ourselves differently. So I don't really have a nuance for who's attacking me, as long as I can make sure that I protect my organization.
Simon, with regards to the hacktivist threat?
Well, I mainly see there is a difference in prioritization, and that there is first more focus by some organizations on the financially motivated cyber threat, because they might likely be less a target for a hacktivism group, and then just they shifting priorities in doing what they have to do to better defend against them.
We're running towards the end of our time, so I'm going to start wrapping this up. But staying on the topic of defense, and is defending LLMs and AIs. We've spoken a lot about their use on the offensive side.
Yeah.
3 points. What do you do? How do you protect your new chat bot?
Oh, yeah. Basically, there is several ways you can secure your AI LLM chatbot. So there is data loss prevention. So there is solution editors. We can do it. An AI posture data management as well is very important to be sure to control what's going on it, and train employees, train people who use it to provide good practice on it and to be sure to use it properly.
Do you predict big AI hacks or hacks against AIs and LLMs, the deep site infrastructure vulnerability type?
Yes, there is some. It's very important to audit LLM when we use open source models, because if we use closed source models like OpenAI or the one, okay, part of the security is made by the provider. So there is other confidential data security we need to implement, but when it's open source, we need to make audit, because if there is we can imagine a backdoor inside an open source model, inside the LLM platform, open source Hugging Face, we found a lot more than 3,000 models which are corrupted, because everybody can put open open source model. Yeah, so we found it in the research part as well. So it's very important to be clear when we use an open source model, we need to audit it, we need to use it properly, we need to know which data we're using with it. And when it's a closed one, there is a security provided by the provider, so it's a little bit easier, but it's a little bit less cheaper as well. So depending of the maturity of the organization on the data and AI field within the whole organization, you can make the choice of your own strategy.
Simon, I'm going to leave the last word to you. The Security Navigator as a tool for CISOs like tomorrow, security managers. How do they get value from it?
Oh, well, there are multiple examples, and I've asked a few quick customers. So yeah, one way to use it is to create awareness based on the statistics that are in there compared with other industries. You can also use the statistics to kick off new projects, to get more buy-in from other colleagues. And lastly, being aware of the continuously changing threat landscape to prepare for the future.
Thanks, Simon. Well, folks, I think that's going to be all we have time for today. It's been a fascinating conversation. So many have stuck with us. Thank you for that. So many people have asked some very interesting questions. Niels, we don't know where you're from, but your questions have been very invigorating. Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you all for your time. We know that you can fly with a lot of different airlines, so thank you for choosing us. To Vikas and Diana joining us remotely, thanks, guys. Always such a pleasure to talk with you. Vikas, I owe you a beer next when I'm back in Cape Town. And to those of you, Tamara, Simon, Anis, for joining us in the studio, thank you so much. Folks at home, please stay in touch. We will share the video. The Navigator is available for download. You can reach us via the information provided. Join, connect with us on LinkedIn, and let's carry on the conversation. And with that, have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and until next time.
Thank you.